Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK week number 2 of the LCK Cup overview analysis, and at the end, power rankings. We are really starting to get into the thick of things. Of course, the final week upcoming, but by the end of this week, we might actually know who the winners group is in the LCK Cup. It's crazy that we already might have that outcome after the first 2 weeks, but of course, if you need a refresher on the format, these teams are split into 2 groups of 5. Each group plays every team from the other group, or each team plays every team from the other group, and then whichever group has more wins comes out as the winners group. Top 3 teams from winners group go on to the main playoffs. The bottom 2 teams from winners group and the top 4 teams from losers group play in a 6-team bracket to determine the last 3 teams to end up entering to the eventual 6-team playoff. Very complicated format, but at the end of the day, we are going to know quite a bit by the end of this week. We've already got to learn a lot in week number 1 with Group Elder taking a very strong lead. Will they be able to keep that up? Obviously, my prediction was yes. I was one of the few analysts that was really high on Group Elder and expecting Group Elder to win going into the split, and yeah, that's how it's turned out. Group Elder has definitely been very, very strong. But if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. If you are new here, what we are going to do in today's video is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving my player of the series and my dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I said, we will be talking about, where the winners group, losers group ends up lying at the end of the week. Still a lot of time for either team to be able to separate, but 13 is the magic number. The moment you hit those 13 wins, you are going to be winners group and moving on to the next round guaranteed. But we saved that for the end of the video. The power rankings, all of that stuff, that's all going to be at the end. We got to start by going series by series, and that means starting with series number 1. Day number 1, it's a battle between an undefeated team and a winless team. Up until this point, it was Dplus KIA taking on BNK FearX, and Dplus KIA is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They are going to stay undefeated, move to 3-0 at the start. BFX moves to 0-3, and both of these teams looking basically identical to how they did in week number 1. DK showing a lot of really intriguing elements, a lot of really positive things for them overall, and BFX showing a couple of diamonds in the rough in terms of, some lanes you can look at and be excited about. Diablo and Kellen are still playing really well. This bot lane is genuinely pretty solid and definitely the strength of the team. They just don't really have the well-roundedness of the roster to be able to compete with really anybody else. If you thought Nongshim was really going to struggle in the middle of the map, well, Raptor and Vikla are definitely kind of bringing up the rear right now in terms of jungle mid rankings, but maybe that's just because they're going into Showmaker and Lucid, who are just absolutely on fire at the moment. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Showmaker. A lot of people are going to point to that Zoe game in game number 3. We really don't see a lot of Zoe in pro play right now. I don't think she's bad as a champion. I think if you want to go that route where, you're not necessarily going to be this gigantic team fight carry, that's totally fine. Like, she can blow people up. It's very easy for her to land a bubble on a Nico or a Xin Zhao or a Renekton or something like that, and all of a sudden the fight is like a 4v5, and that definitely is a positive, but there are ways to shut down Zoe. Showmaker's just really good at the champion, and he's clearly in very good form at the start of this year. I've been a big Showmaker defender over the past couple of years. That's very much looking like it's a good decision right now, and you know what? Lucid looks incredible at the current moment. Like, there are so many things I could say about what Lucid is doing in the early and in the mid game that is setting up DK for success, that's allowing everybody else on this team to be able to play their most optimal style, but I'll save that for a little bit later in the week, because this isn't the only series that Lucid is going to do well in, spoiler alert, as I'm sure a lot of people already know, but he is really breaking out. Like, he is really rising up the ranks of not just like the LCK junglers, but like LCK players and, by proxy, the best players in the world. We talked about it last week, how if he could have that top 10 player in the world kind of breakout year, it's not going to be the most surprising thing in the world. It's going to be pretty massive for DK, and that's kind of what they're relying on in order to be one of the best teams in the world, like I think they can be. We saw that gradual growth from Lucid last year, where he was not very good at all in spring. It's very difficult to be good in the LCK as a rookie, but he got a lot better in spring playoffs, carried that over into the summer split, where he was a top 3-ish jungler in the LCK, like somewhere in that, vein. He was pretty solid for a majority of the regular season, was able to go to Worlds and get some experience there, and now this is going to be the year, it seems like, where he's just going to completely, like, destroy all expectations, break out, and become the star of this team. If this is the best jungle mid duo in the league, which right now they're kind of playing like that, this is going to be a terrifying team to break down, and it's not even just them. Like, Beryl is a psychopath. This is, like, Damwon Beryl back again. He is going to die a lot for absolutely no reason, and there were parts in game number 2, especially on the Pantheon, where Kellen just completely outplayed him and just put him kind of in a really bad position. Very funny to say that, considering Kellen is the one that Beryl is replacing here on Dplus KIA, but for the most part, Beryl was more than a positive overall in this series if you take out that Alistar game in game, or that Pantheon game for Beryl, and then that Alistar game for Kellen in game number 2. Aiming continues to be fine. I don't really need to call his name ever. He continues to be such a background player on this team that it's not even really worth mentioning. Maybe the aiming lovers are still going to get mad at me in the comment section, but it's just kind of what I'm seeing. I am excited by Siwoo, though. I think this guy is developing really, really quickly. His mechanics are very much translating very quickly to the LCK. Again, he's still making some minor mistakes, but you can work that out. You can kind of coach that out, and experience will definitely fix that. It was kind of similar to what happened with Lucid last year, where he was just relying a little bit too much on the hands and a little bit too little on the brain. I think Siwoo is going to be just fine. He's already starting so hot, but this jungle mid is exceptionally good, and they're going to carry DK very, very far. This team's sitting at 3-0, and, you know, it's not going to get easier throughout the rest of this split. Like, BFX is a pretty easy, you know, challenger, but they've already shown that they can go up against some of the top teams in the league and perform very similarly. But for BFX, I think they're going to be happy they picked up a win at all in this series, that they were able to take that second game in game number 2, because everything else was just kind of going wrong. The jungle gap, the mid gap, it was just absolutely ginormous here. Raptor's going to get my dud of the series, but I think you could give this to Vikla. It should go to one of those two, because neither of them were particularly good. Vikla in particular was awful in game number 3 on the Galio, and I think that's why a lot of people are just inherently going to give it to him, because I think recency bias is going to put that in a lot of people's minds. It closed out the series with a really terrible game and the most dominant game of the series. I mean, game 1 was pretty dominant as well, but you know what I mean. But I think Raptor was more consistently bad across all 3 games. Even in their win in game number 2, didn't really feel like he was doing all that much on the Wukong, and he was awful in game 1 on the Vi. He was really bad in game number 3 on the Xin Zhao. It just felt like he was getting completely outplayed basically every single time he stepped onto the Rift in this series. Like, Lucid was just better than him in every aspect, and that's a disaster for Raptor. He is the player that is supposed to be kind of carrying the early and mid game for this team, not only because he kind of did that last year, but because they don't really have other players on this team that are good in that phase. Diablo is good in that phase of the game, but he is still very young and still very greedy in terms of what he is trying to take on the map, and so it ends up creating situations where it's not always positive. Raptor is supposed to be stepping up, but he's not doing that. But like I said, Diablo, Kellen, still looking pretty good as a bot lane. I'm not going to sit here and say they were better than Aiming and Beryl, because they were not, but they won game number 2. Zeri and Alistar were exceptionally strong in that second game, and honestly, I would have given Kellen player of the game for that second game if only they had won that series overall. It's looking good. I think getting Kellen in the room, a veteran who is, you know, known for his mental and known for his shot calling, to get Diablo into a position where he can capitalize on his mechanics, it's been a positive. Unfortunately, it's not translated to the macro of the rest of this team, which just doesn't exist right now. So for BFX, they're not very good, right? We projected this. They were number 10 in my preseason rankings, and they have continued to be the number 10 team in the LCK. Outside of the bot lane, there's really not a lot of excitement on this team right now. Raptor and Clear have definitely taken steps back from last year, and I was already low on Clear. And then Dplus KIA showed exactly what they showed in week number 1, which is that they can be one of the best teams in the world. This jungle mid is incredibly legit. Siwoo is adapting very quickly, and Beryl has very much fit back into his place here on DK. This is a very fun team to watch right now, and they are deservedly undefeated after a couple of, let's just say, destructive wins in this series. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and going from an undefeated versus winless matchup to a battle of 2 1-1 teams, it's the DN Freecs taking on DRX, and DRX is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. If Group Baron wasn't in trouble before, they are very much in trouble now. This is not the nail in the coffin or anything like that, but it certainly does make it a lot more difficult for this team to come back with DNF getting upset here. DRX is legit good, and I'm really happy to be able to say that. Obviously, I was a little bit higher on DRX coming out of the offseason, mostly because I just loved UCal, and I thought people were going to underestimate this team with UCal and Teddy as a duo, and, you know, I thought Ondo would be generally fine at the start, even if I thought it was a mistake bringing him in over Plata. Well, Teddy is out, LazyFeel is in. Teddy looks like he's probably going to take the entire split off, and LazyFeel is going to be playing until further notice. That is definitely a little bit of a hit to DRX, even though he is playing well. He's not Teddy. He doesn't have that kind of experience playing against top competition regularly, day in and day out. And, you know, the jungle position is still a question mark. I think top lane has been a question mark. For me, Rich was not particularly good in week number 1, especially in their loss. But at the end of the day, if they have the best player on the Rift when they're playing against these mid-table teams, they are always going to have a chance to be able to come out on top. And that right now is the case. UCal really is that damn good. It's not just UCal. I want to give some credit to the rest of this team because I do think there has been some stabilization elsewhere, but he is the superstar on this team. He is making a very strong case right now to be considered amongst the top 4 or top 5 mid laners in the LCK, which was thought to be untouchable at the beginning of the year. The fact that he's in that conversation is genuinely absurd. It kind of feels like Zeka coming back over from the LPL after a couple of years on Billy Gaming and kind of re-cementing himself in the LCK, getting into that upper echelon. I think UCal can do the same. I just think UCal, you know, is a different player, and he does it in a very different way. He did it on a Zeka champion in this one with the Sylas. In game number 3, he was utilizing those ultimates on DNF a lot better than they were. The Nico ult, the Orianna ult, you know, things like that. They're just very, very difficult to deal with on a champion like Sylas that can get in so effortlessly, that has so many tools to be able to disrupt, and UCal did such a phenomenal job of being able to utilize it. But, you know, I really do think that this entire team revolves around him. It's why we talked about it last week when this team was struggling, when they did end up losing, and when UCal was playing really well in that series. The problem that DRX is going to run into is that I think good teams are going to be able to take out the other members of this team. But as I said, if you have the best player on the Rift against DNF, if there's nobody else on the enemy side that's as good as UCal, no matter how good Berserker played in this series, then yeah, UCal is going to be able to take over, and he is probably going to be able to win you some games. I do want to give a major shout out to LazyFeel, because this is a very difficult position to be put in. Not only is DRX kind of fighting for a top 3 seed right now in the playoffs, just with the way that these groups ended up breaking down, but he's doing it against players like Berserker that have a ton of top-level experience, even in other countries. It's just a very, very difficult thing to come in, and it's not like Berserker played bad in this series. We'll get to that. He dominated for the most part in this series, but LazyFeel is very much keeping his own in this bot lane. It's not like Diablo. Like Diablo, I compare to a former DRX bot laner in Paddock. I think they're very similar in terms of playstyle. LazyFeel has come in and really solidified the bot side of the map, and even though Ondel isn't exactly playing out of his mind at the current moment, LazyFeel is doing enough to be able to survive the 2v2 and be very useful in the later half of the game, which is all you really need to do as an AD carry. That was supposed to be Teddy's role. That's what Teddy, you know, does at a really high level. If LazyFeel can come in and do that, that's going to be fantastic. If he can be what Teddy was expected to be, that's ginormous. Sponge has also, like, been pretty good, I would say, at the start of the split. He hasn't been exceptional. He hasn't, like, broken the game open or anything like that. He's not making superstar plays, but he's not losing against players like Pioshik, which is certainly an upgrade over whatever he was last year, which was one of the worst players in the entirety of the LCK. So credit to Sponge for stabilizing. Rich was fine here. Ondel was definitely a little bit too far forward, especially in their game 1 loss on the Leona, but overall, DRX being able to pick up the win is massive. They sit at 2-1. They're fighting out for one of those top 3 seeds in Group Elder. If that group does end up becoming winners group, remember the top 3 teams in that group immediately go to the playoffs. DRX is very much in the mix for that, and DNF is going to feel really bad about this loss. It felt like this team was starting to solidify what they were. They picked up that week 1 win over Nongshim that I don't think a lot of people kind of expected them to get. I was a person who put them in the top 5. I thought that they were going to be a team that was a lot closer to being, you know, KT Rolster level than they were to being DRX or Nongshim level, but unfortunately they still do have their individual problems. That does not come down to the bot lane or the top lane in this one, because Berserker was unfreaking believable. Unbelievably good series from Berserker. It just didn't end up mattering. Not really a lot that he could do in the back half of these games. He did end up kind of screwing over life at the back half of game number 3, but he was the one who got them there, and he was the one who was going to win them those games, and so it's really hard to criticize him really under any front. He was excellent on the Kai'Sa in game number 1 as well. I also think Life was really good in this series. Some people might blame Life a little bit too much for some of those Nico ultimates in game 3, or for Sylas potentially being more useful in game number 3, utilizing those Nico ultimates, but Life I think was still very good throughout most of this series, as was Dudu on the top side. The Ambessa in game number 1, really, really solid. He was fine on the Rumble and on the Gragas. He just wasn't really able to affect the game in that kind of way, even if he was better than Rich. The problem was the middle of the map for DNF. Pioshik and Bulldog just don't really seem to have any chemistry. Talked about this a bit last week. Pyosik feels entirely disconnected from this team. Berserker and Life feel like they're on the same page, but Pyosik doesn't really seem to have chemistry with Bulldog. He really doesn't seem to have any chemistry with Life. It just doesn't feel like Pyosik is a very good fit on DNF right now, and it's kind of causing them some problems. But dud of the series for me is going to go to Bulldog, mostly for that game 3 on the Orianna. I mean, the Corki game in game 2 also kind of plays into this, but not a particularly good series from Bulldog. I'm getting a lot closer to putting him in that closer tier of mid laners as opposed to somebody that could rise up and be kind of where UCal is right now, you know, growing in to a player that can compete with the top 4 or top 5 guys. It felt like Bulldog was on that kind of trajectory, but to me, it's kind of just gotten worse and worse over the last couple of splits. It's gone in a bad direction, and watching UCal just completely outplay him in the back half of this series, it's just not an encouraging sign. Bulldog needs to get back on the right track. I think he has the talent to do it, but I think his mentality has shifted so much into being a lot more passive and a lot more safe that I'm not sure if he's ever going to be able to get that aggressive, like, game breaker type of tendency back that he kind of needs to be on this team right now. But like I said, Pyosik really needs to lock it in. It feels like he just is not mentally locked in at the moment, or communicatively locked in with Bulldog or Life or Berserker or Dudu. It feels like he's an outlier on this team, and that's got to fix real quick. But for DRX, this is a very, very big win. Even if it wasn't perfect, and even if there are things on this team that you would want to try and fix, or you would want to try and, you know, scale up and get better, like, at the end of the day, you have UCal, who could be a top 10 player in the LCK at the current moment. And if you got that, you have a team that can actually compete near the top. But then moving on now to day number 2, and honestly, were we ever supposed to expect there not to be an upset of this kind of caliber in the LCK at the start of the year? It's always pandemonium in January. It's OK BRION taking on Gen.G, and of course OK BRION wins, and they don't just win, they sweep them. It's 2-0. They don't drop a single game. Gen.G loses its first 2 games of the year here in the second week, and Bro picks up its first series win of the year outside of the Kespa Cup, obviously. Were we ever supposed to expect this to go any other way? Honestly, I'm kicking myself for not talking about this in last week's video, because we should have known that Bro was going to take this. We should have known that they were going to be the team that came out and just ended Gen.G's undefeated season and, you know, kind of got Baron back on track, or at least put them back into the driver's seat, undid the mistake that DNF made on the day before losing to DRX. It's a ridiculous outcome for Bro, but a pretty important one for them overall. For Gen.G, obviously this kind of sucks, but spoiler alert, if you're gonna, you know, come in here and tell me to say that this is choky and this is a really good case that Gen.G's not actually good, you're not gonna get that here, and you should probably just skip forward, because you're probably not gonna like what I'm gonna say. At the end of the day, this happens every single year, and every single year it doesn't matter domestically, Bro. I'm really happy, looked really good here. We'll see if they can follow it up later in the week, but let's talk about what they did here that I think could be sustainable, and what I think is maybe just a little bit of Gen.G kind of taking advantage, or kind of taking the piss, I would say, in this series. Player of the series is pretty obviously Hype. I don't really know how you could possibly give it to anybody else. Hype was really the one player on this team that I thought looked okay in week number 1, at least all things considered. He was benched in that second series, so it's hard to give like a definitive statement because Bull came in and played that second loss for them, but he was okay in their first series, even though they ended up losing. Certainly the KT Challengers player that came into Bro that looked better in week number 1, we'll just say, with Hanwha really struggling in that first week, but he keeps that pace going and quite frankly just completely outduels Ruler in this matchup. Certainly not something that I think anybody could have anticipated, but the Kaisa, the Ashe, both of them look phenomenal. If he's going to be a guy that can compete for like top 5 or top 6 in terms of AD carries in year number 1, I'm not going to really be all that surprised. The only thing that would concern me is the rest of this team going to be good enough to be able to give him that kind of pace and give him the opportunity to be able to play like that? At least in this series, the answer to that question was yes. Polu was pretty good here on the Alistar, on the Rel. Don't know how sustainable that is. Polu is not necessarily somebody with a fantastic track record in the LCK, but this was a really good series, and I think one of the big positives for me is just how well Hanwha played, and I guess this kind of ties into the core thesis of what I said earlier, where I think that some of the changes here, or some of the things that went right for them, I think they are sustainable, and some I just don't think are. I think the Hype movement is sustainable. I think he is the kind of player that really could break out this year. We talked about that. Hanwha, the way he played this series, I'm not saying Hanwha can't be good, but the way that he got his leads in this series and the way that he was really able to kind of stay in games in this series, it just really wasn't all him. He wasn't really the one doing it. It was more so Canyon just really being off his game, having a really terrible Zyra performance in game number 1 and just being super inactive on the Xin Zhao in game number 2, and Hanwha kind of getting a free chance to be able to get to the stage of the game that I think he's better at, which is the late game. And if you want to point to a couple of 5v5 moments where Hanwha was genuinely able to take over and really pop off some highlight moments in these team fights, if you will. I very much think that there were multiple of those throughout these games that I think really give me a lot of, a lot of positive feelings towards whether or not he can grow into a good player, but his early games are still mega inconsistent, and that is the part that I still am concerned about. Hanwha just was so terrible in week number 1 that one series against Canyon is not going to completely change my mind, mostly because it was Canyon playing bad and not so much Hanwha doing all of these, major changes to get himself back into the game. That being said, Closer was good. He was pretty okay in week number 1, certainly wasn't a disaster in that first week, and he was better than Chovy here, which is a shocker. And then Morgan was fine here. Keen was not necessarily all that successful, especially in game 2 on the Urgot, and Morgan took advantage of that. Bro was just kind of more clean, we'll just say, throughout the back half, especially in the team fighting stage of these games, and that's what kind of got them over the line. They did a good job to be able to bide their time and then win 5v5s in the back half with things like Kaisa and Azir as their primary carries, and that's really what you want to see out of a team like Bro. For Gen.G, I'm not going to freak out and say that this team is suddenly bad. We saw in week number 1 that they were the most dominant team to come out of the first week and that they looked exactly how we thought they would look as the number 1 team. I'm not going to sit here and say that these 2 games are my full perception of Gen.G, but I am going to say that I am a bit concerned about, what we saw here today. Canyon and Chovy in particular just not looking great. Canyon especially, I think, played really bad here. We know that when Canyon loses, he loses very hard. This has always been the case, even going back to his prime. When you look at 2020 or 2021 Canyon, he still was losing. He just was doing it so much less often because his mechanics were still ridiculous. But specifically when you look at 2022, 2023, in terms of his last couple of years on Damwon and on Dplus KIA, this is the Canyon that we saw every so often. He is going to lose a couple of matchups, and he's going to be really passive, and he's going to play really bad on a champion like Zyra for absolutely no reason, and you just kind of have to live with it. He didn't really do it all that much last year, and so I think we kind of forgot about it, but I would be lying if I said that 2022, 2023 Canyon didn't show exactly what he showed in this series every so often, even with him still being a positive in those influences. Chovy needed to be better here. He was coming off of being a really valuable player in week number 1, one of the most in the entire world. Obviously, it's Chovy. I think he's going to be just fine, but he got outplayed by Closer. Simple as that. Keen was not good here. Morgan was definitely the better top laner. Ruler and Duro were not the better bot lane. Ruler wasn't the problem. Neither was Duro, in my opinion. I actually think Duro had a pretty decent series, all things considered, but Hype and Polu were better. Hype in particular was definitely better than his counterpart on the other side of this matchup. It's definitely concerning in the sense that you don't want to see it, but I'm not concerned that Gen.G is all of a sudden going to be a bad team. I imagine they're going to be just fine moving forward, and that this is going to be just one of those losses we look back and laugh on. Canyon losing to Bro. Name a more iconic duo. It's happened so much over the course of his career that at this point you just have to accept it. And then for Bro on the other side, God, I hope they can keep this up. Obviously, I don't want this team to be bad. Just because I predicted them to be bad against the grain doesn't mean I want them to be bad. I want to see players like Hype and Hanwha that were so good in the Challengers League keep that pace up. I want to see someone like Polu kind of break out of this bad narrative that I had given to him. Morgan has been such a trooper on Bro for so many years. Closer, I think, has had opportunities but has never really broken through. I would love to be proven wrong in terms of this team maybe not being as good as this result would indicate, but that's only something that time will tell. We're going to have to see in some of their future performances. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and going from an upset matchup between a top team and a bottom team to a top team versus bottom team going exactly how it should. It's Hanwha Life Esports taking on NS RedForce. I say that, but it's not exactly like this was the cleanest win of all time for HLE. They're still showing a lot of weird problems that I just don't think I was expecting them to have at the start of this split. I thought this team would actually start very hot, considering that the bottom 4 members of this team are all the exact same from last year. Peanut, Zeka, Viper, Delight, the core of this team have all been retained from their championship winning team last year, but it's not exactly working out in that regard. Obviously, they got destroyed by Gen.G last week, but they've been able to bounce back, and, to their credit, they're still picking up wins. It's not like they're throwing away games against teams like Nongshim in the same way that Gen.G just threw 2 away against Bro, but they should probably do it a little bit more consistently, and, for Nongshim's case, unfortunately, this was the team that was talked about at the beginning of the season. This is the team that we kind of previewed in the primer, where it doesn't really matter how well a player like Jiwoo ends up playing or how well someone like Kingin ends up playing. The middle of the map is just such a disaster for Nongshim that they're not really given a lot of opportunities to win. So Let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the series, to me, is going to go to Delight. Now, I think a lot of people are going to give this to Viper. I think just naturally, Viper will get a lot of the praise because of the score lines. Caitlyn Lux was definitely the storyline of game number 2, in my opinion, and the Xayah was excellent in game number 1, but Viper made a lot of weird positioning errors throughout this series that kind of put him in bad positions that I just don't think needed to be made, in the same way that I think Peanut made quite a few mistakes, or that Zeka actually made quite a few mistakes. I think the core of HLE was just very sloppy in this series, and to me, the one player that actually was consistent at playing his role and doing the things he was supposed to do was Delight. The Caitlyn Lux was the most dominant part of game number 2, but if Viper is going to receive all the praise, I think Delight deserves just as much, and the Poppy was super valuable in game number 1 at being able to set up for the rest of the team. And so to me, Delight definitely kind of the player that came out of this looking the most consistent, and the one that I think played the best across both games and didn't really make any mistakes or didn't really cause any errors. I think you could give this to Viper. His best moments were the best in the series. He was able to carry through his damage, especially on the Xayah in game number 1. But again, I think those positioning errors do kind of knock him down a couple of pegs for me. And then, same thing for Peanut and Zeka. Their score lines look good, but they weren't exactly like consistent throughout a lot of these moments, especially Peanut, who I think ran into a couple of weird issues. But I think a lot of the attention is going to be brought to Zeus because a lot of people are calling him Doran 2.0 on this team. They traded out Doran for Zeus only to turn Zeus into Doran is kind of the prevailing thought. I'm not really sure why a lot of people thought Zeus was going to come in and dominate in the regular season. He's never done that. Even for T1, he's never really been that first team all-pro, unbelievable top laner. The only time I can remember him doing that, I believe, was 2023 spring. I could be wrong about the exact date of that, but that's the only time I think I've ever given him first team All-Pro in terms of, where I've put him at the end of these regular seasons. He's just not a regular season guy. He does take a lot of these games off, and he's kind of turned into a super weak side player for this team as they try to capitalize on a lot of the inherent synergy that they thought that they were going to have coming into this season. And while I do think the synergy is there, it's not like they're making communication errors, and it doesn't feel like they're combating each other in terms of their calls. It just feels like there are tiny micro mistakes from the rest of the team, and that's where you would kind of hope someone like Zeus would step up, but he's just been really passive. I think Kingen was better than Zeus in this series, and that's not necessarily something you love hearing. Overall, HLE's fine. They still won 2-0, but there are concerns with this team. It wasn't exactly a perfect win for them by any means, and for Nongshim on the other side, again, this was unfortunately exactly what we thought they were going to be in the preseason, and not really what we saw in week number 1. Yes, Fisher wasn't particularly good, but Gideon looked excellent in that first week. It looked like he was actually going to be one of, if not the best player on the team, or certainly one of the players that they were going to play through. Lehens was playing super aggro, flipping the game basically every moment he could because he wanted to create for the rest of his team. And, Jiwoo and Kingen, I think, were doing a good job of following up. Kingen wasn't very good in their loss. He was pretty good in their win, etc., etc. But unfortunately, in this one, it all comes crashing down. The bot lane is good. The top side, I think, is fine, solid. Middle of the map is a disaster. Fisher is a very easy choice for dead of the series. Everybody's laughing at him because he picked Corki, and Corki is now 0-10 in the LCK, which, yes, is a very funny statistic. Right now, it just feels like that champion is cursed at the LCK level, but it's performing fine elsewhere. Like, if you look at the statistics, it's got like a 44% win rate globally, which isn't very good, but considering the fact it has a 0% win rate in the LCK, I think it must be winning everywhere else. I haven't backed that up in a couple of days, but Corki is not the worst pick in the entire universe. It just doesn't really seem to be working at the LCK level. I can't really tell you why. I'm honestly not all that offended by the Corki game. I think that one was bad, and he was the worst player on the Rift, but that Mbessa game was awful in game number 1, and this is the Fisher I think we all kind of expected. Just a player who doesn't have the mechanics and looks pretty outclassed at this level. I just don't really expect him to be able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the other mid laners in the LCK. Even the middle tier ones, I think, are a cut above him. I think players like Closer and Bulldog are just better than Fisher, which is really not a place that you want to be because he had to go up against Zeka in this series, and Zeka was making mistakes. He was putting himself in bad positions. He was not playing particularly consistent or clean League of Legends, and yet he still was outclassing Fisher basically in every aspect. It's just not a very good look. Nongshim is really going to struggle if mid lane is going to be a disaster. And I think, unfortunately for Nongshim, this could be a sign of things to come. That being said, Gideon was excellent in week number 1 and just didn't really have the firepower to be able to compete here. Kingen, I thought, was fine. He was maybe even better than Zeus at times and certainly more active in this series. And Jiwoo and Lehens were trying to win some of these games. Jiwoo had a ton of gold. He just was really aggro with trying to spend it and, kind of put him in some bad positions. But overall, like, Nongshim had opportunities. They just played incredibly slow and didn't really have great execution. A lot of that because they had no prio in the middle of the map. And for Hanwha Life, a lot of things to clean up. I think the core of this team definitely has to get better. They've not exactly started this split in the hottest of ways. In my opinion, Zeka was really good. good in week number 1, but everybody else I think really needs to lock it in, and this was not one of those wins that kind of sold me on this team getting back to that top 2 or top 3 guaranteed. They're still going to need to show me a lot more. But then moving on to day number 3, our middle day of the week here, and it's yet another big outcome for Group Elder. It's DRX taking on BNK FearX, and DRX is going to pick up the win. I know I had a lot of X's in there, but DRX is going to be able to come out on top. They're going to move to 3-1 after the first 2 weeks of action here, and they have put themselves in about as good of a position as you could ask to get top 3 in this group. It's actually insane how they have landed where they are at the current moment. I'm so happy for them. It feels like this team is really clicking on a lot of different levels. Again, not everything is perfect. There are things that are going wrong for this team. There are things that I think need to be cleaned up, but they are a fine enough team, a team that I think is going to be somewhere around top 6 for this split, and maybe even moving forward, maybe into, splits like the spring. So we'll see how it ends up, transpiring for DRX, but right now they're sitting at 6-5. They're sitting at 3-1. This is a really good spot for DRX and about as good of a start as you could ask for. And for BFX on the other side, it's obviously kind of the opposite. You're sitting at 3-8. You're sitting at 0-4 in terms of your best of 3s, and things just aren't working out. There are a lot of things wrong with this team, but once again, it's going to be a lot of what we already talked about in the previous series because it's basically the same story. It's Diablo and Kellen doing a lot of really good things for this team and creating a lot of really big plays for BFX, and then the top side of the map just being awful and just kind of letting them down in every way possible. So we'll go ahead and get to it. Player of the series for me is gonna go to Sponge in the jungle. Sponge is playing well right now, guys. I don't want to jinx it. I don't want to try to overhype him because Raptor is really off his game at the moment. He had a really terrible week overall for BFX, but Sponge looks good. He's played 4 series for DRX, and honestly, he's looked competent in all 4. Specifically, all 3 of their wins, he's really been a big factor. And that Lilia game in game number 3 was dominant. He was excellent in that game for DRX. I know we talk about it a lot, and I'm going to reiterate it basically every single time that I can on this channel, but it's hard to be a rookie in the LCK and succeed. We've seen this super regularly. It's very difficult, especially to come into a team full of other rookies and be able to make that work. A lot of those teams just don't really find any sort of consistency in their first year and end up not really developing in that regard because you need that vocal presence from a veteran to typically be able to guide rookies in the right direction. It's what we saw, from Lucid last year. And I'm not saying Sponge is as good as Lucid. I'm certainly not trying to make that argument, but what I am trying to say is now that you've got some veterans in the building here, not that you've got, someone like Ondel who has played for quite a bit, but Yucal who's very experienced, Rich at this point who's very experienced in multiple different regions, like these are much bigger influences, I would say, than anything that Sponge had last year on DRX, and it's very much working out for him, at least at the start here. Very small sample size, only 4 best of 3s, but they've looked pretty good, and he was really good here. Again, you gotta shout out Yucal. I think if the Lee Sin had actually popped off in game number 3, he would have easily gotten player of the series here, but the Lee Sin just ends up being kind of meh in the mid lane here. I'm certainly not trying to critique it. It's not even the first Lee Sin mid I've covered on this channel this year, but at the end of the day, Corki can't pick up a win even against a Lee Sin mid. It's never ideal. Still, Yucal's Jace game in game number 1 was excellent, and I think you could theoretically give him player of the series if you really wanted to do so. I just don't necessarily think that game 3 was nearly high enough impact in my opinion. Rich was also really good here. I think this was probably his best series of the year up until this point. I've been pretty critical of Rich so far in the LCK. I think he's actually been kind of a negative on the top side. His laning stats don't look particularly good. Not that that's surprising. That's his biggest weakness as a player, but he was really good here into Clear, who just looks completely checked out. Like, just doesn't look like he's going to be able to operate at an LCK level this year. Again, we'll get to it when we get to BFX, but LazyFeel, Ondel, they're fine. Like, Ondel had a better series, I would say, here than he did earlier in the week, even though both were wins, and I think LazyFeel maybe had a little bit of a worse series. Diablo was the better of these 2 AD carries for sure, and I think Kellen put a lot of pressure on LazyFeel that he hadn't really felt in a lot of the other series, and definitely was more up and down because of that, but it certainly wasn't the biggest disaster in the world or anything. I just think that Sponge and Yucal were definitely the standouts, and I think topside was actually a positive for the first time in a while for DRX. So, some really good stuff there, especially Sponge looking good, and then for BFX, like, they are who they are. They're 0-4. This is the worst team in the LCK. This is what we predicted coming into the year. I know not everybody was on that train. People thought that, maybe Diablo was going to be good. Maybe, Vikla and Raptor could turn it around here in the LCK. I just didn't really see that happening. And even with the bot lane being good, right? Like, Diablo and Kellen are actually solid. They're a mid-table bot lane for sure. It's just the top side of this map is such a disaster. Whoever you want to give dud of the series to, I think it's totally wide open. Clear, Raptor, Vikla, all of them deserve it. All of them are playing so poor. 4. I'm going to give it to Raptor because I do think he was making the most head-scratching plays. It very much feels like he is actively throwing away games for his team. At the current moment, we always knew he was an aggressive player, very similar to Willer in that respect where his good games look good and his bad games look really bad, but the bad games have just become a lot more common, and I just don't think he's as mechanically talented as someone like Willer. And, you know, even if I was calling him like 85% of Willer, 85% of Willer isn't particularly good in the current landscape of the LCK, and he's really struggling. Losing to Sponge is about as worst case scenario as it gets, especially as bad as he did in Game 3, but Vikla and Clear are still mega outclassed. Vikla did nothing in this series. He got obliterated by UCal, ends up picking Corki, which is obviously very funny in hindsight with, you know, 0-11, like this champion can't pick up a win, but Vikla just continues to not be anything at this level. He has lost all his confidence and all his ability to play whatever there was in 2022 for KT Rolster. It's gone at this point. North America was, you know, solid in spring split of 2023. Summer was a disaster, and ever since then he's been bad. There's just nothing else left to say. And Clear, I mean, what a horrible start to the year for Clear. He has been getting dominated by everybody in lane. It just looks really bad. His Aurora game was awful, like truly awful. I really considered Clear for dud of the series here, but BFX just is very predictable in terms of their outcomes. They're not going to be a team that's going to be able to win a best of 3 because the top side of their map is so bad, but they're going to be able to stay in some of these games because Diablo and Kellen are going to be able to keep them in it. You know, BFX is what they are. Unfortunately, that's probably the worst team in the league, and they probably will be eliminated here in the group stage unless something major happens at the end of next week. And then for DRX, again, they're sitting at 3-1. This is ginormous for them. They're in a really good position to get out of this group, not only like going into the first round of the playoff, but being like a top 3 seed and auto-qualifying for the actual playoffs. Like, it's crazy to say that, but that's where they're at. Sponge is looking good. UCal is looking like an MVP. You know, Lazyfield and Ondo look good. Rich had his best series here. There's so many positives to talk about for DRX. I just hope that they can keep it up. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's our first telecom war of the year. It's always a fun time getting into these matchups. T1 taking on KT Rolster, and T1 is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Now, that in and of itself is not like all that much of a surprise. It's not a shocker. It's not anything like that. There is obviously expectations for T1 to be better than KT Rolster, who has not exactly started off this split in the best spot, but it's definitely not the T1 that you expected going into the series. Gumayushi was out and Smash was in. I saw a lot of people talking about, oh, why would they make this decision? You know, is Guma benched permanently? Like, are they out on Guma? Like, you know, why would you bench a guy who's one of the best ADCs in the world? You know, I'm a long-time League fan. I'm certainly a long-time Coma fan, and this is just what he does. Like, he's always done this. This is kind of the T1 special. It's the Coma special, if we're being entirely honest, subbing Faker out for Easy Hoon or for Closer or whoever you want to end up calling the mid laner there, subbing top lane out over and over again. You know, a couple of years, you know, many years ago now, I guess like 2016 era, you know, just trying to figure out anybody in the top lane to play. Like, this has always been something that T1 and Coma specifically has done over the course of his career. He just wants to give Smash some stage time, and he thinks KT's beatable with Smash. And you know what? He was absolutely right. And not just with Smash, because of Smash. Because he's not only playing here, he's player of the series. This dude popped off in his LCK debut. What a great performance for him. We've been talking him up quite a bit over the course of this offseason on this channel. I was really kind of in the camp of if I was an LEC team this offseason and I had the opportunity to bring in like Smash and Reckless as a bot lane, I would do basically anything to do that. I think almost any team in the league would have upgraded from that. That was my like fantasy booking like Fnatic bot lane for quite a bit of this offseason, and obviously that didn't work, and obviously they, you know, Smash ends up staying. That's a good deal for Smash. He would much rather be in T1's Challengers team than on Fnatic, in my opinion, but, you know, he's a really good player. Like, this is a guy who I think could dominate, like, a tier 1 region in the LTA or in the LEC, basically, right now, and he came in and kind of showed that off. He was definitely the better of these 280 carries, and certainly the best player in these two bot lanes. I think he did receive a lot of favoritism from the team, but at the end of the day, he still had to capitalize on it, which is exactly what he did. So, credit to him, great mechanics, seems like he has a good head on his shoulders, isn't a perfect player just yet, had a couple of mistakes in terms of his positioning throughout this series, especially on the Ezreal, but at the end of the day, you're going to clean those things up. Like, that's something that comes with time in the LCK, especially playing with someone like Faker and someone like KT, these very vocal players who are going to help you clean that kind of stuff up. I'm not worried about Smash. If he ever does get an extended role here as a starter for T1, I think he's going to be just fine and probably one of the top 3 to 4 AD carries in the LCK from day number 1. But the other player who was awesome here, Doran in the top lane, who was excellent in this series. He was really good, super aggro. I mean, the dude was just going in and trying to flip and trade 1v1 and 5v5, start fights with Rumble Equalizer, step up and try to 2v1 in constant situations. Like, he was super greedy and aggro in this series, but for the most part, I really like that. I think a lot of people are like, whoa, who's this Doran? What's this version of Doran? Zeus playing passive and Doran being aggressive? Did they just flip mentalities? I don't think people watch regular season games. Like, I genuinely just don't know if people have watched Doran the last couple of years. He was so aggro on Gen.G in 2023. He was pretty aggro in summer of last year for HLE. He just ended up kind of phasing out of that role, especially as they got into the playoffs because they wanted to play for Viper a lot more on the bottom side of the map. But pretending like Doran is not a player who has done really well domestically in the regular season in the last 3 years is insane to me. He's been better than Zeus domestically in the regular season. I said that in my offseason grades video, and that is very much standing true here. Doran, the problem with him has never been like the regular season or a lot of these best of threes. The problem has always been international events, and right now we're not there. Doran's doing really well, and he had a really good series here. I think that obviously there are some things you want to clean up, but for the most part, I would rather him be super aggro like this than be passive, especially on a team with this much talent. KT was excellent here. He's going to get a little bit undersold because of how good and how flashy Smash was in this series. Owner and Faker were along for the ride. Again, I don't want to criticize them, but somebody was yelling at me that I didn't give too much enough praise to Faker in their loss in week 1 to Dplus KIA. My bad. This was fine. Like, again, he's not really been the main character for them. Smash and Doran, definitely the standouts here. But for KT on the other side, this bot lane sucks. Like, there's really no other way to say it. And as much as I'd like to sit here and say that Dekdom is a scapegoat, which he kind of is, I very much want to preface this with Dekdom is receiving all of the hate for this bot lane, which is entirely unfounded, and we'll get to that. He is definitely a part of it. This is like a bottom 2 bot lane in the LCK at the current moment. Now, again, not all of that is Dekdom. Dud of the series for me goes to Wei. This guy looks awful at the current moment, and it's kind of similar to what I was saying with Hambach last week over on KT, or on Bro, where I get it. Like, a lot of KT Challengers prospects are super hyped, but I want to reiterate, it's really freaking hard to be a rookie in the LCK and to go up against KT and to go up against Faker and to go up against Owner and to like really hold your own in a lot of those circumstances. Smash obviously has such a small sample size, he's not really a proper comparison, and it's really good to see that Hype played well in the previous series earlier on this week, but pretending like we're expecting these rookies to be consistent year 1 is just insane to me, and I don't want to sit here and say that Wei is a good player or Wei is a bad player. All I'm going to say is right now, it doesn't look good and things are going to have to get better for him. I hope that this org gives him time to be able to develop that, because I don't think Dekdom is helping things out at the current moment, but Wei has been pretty awful to start off this year for KT. And then for Dekdom, I'm just going to reiterate what a lot of people are saying. Like, mechanically speaking, he is just a tier below, like, the upper echelon of AD carries. I think he's a lot closer to being Teddy than he is to being, Gumayushi, right? And that's just unfortunate for KT, because at the start of this offseason, it felt like, oh, we might get Ruler, we might get Pays. The expectations were just so high. Hell, they might have even promoted Hype, who I think has a higher mechanical ceiling than Dekdom. They end up settling for Dekdom. He's just not been playing well. Hopefully he gets back into form. He was good last year. I think people forget that. He was also good on DRX. People are like, oh, this guy hasn't been good. He was carried by Peanut on Nongshim. He was never somebody that was actually all that good. He's been good at basically every stop he's been on. He's just been the scapegoat at basically every stop he's been on. Now, I'm not saying, I think this is probably the worst he's played in quite a while. I'm not trying to sit here and say that he doesn't deserve his fair share of blame. I really do not think he's in good form right now, and I'm certainly admitting that, but him and Wei are both bad. Like, we can't just blame this on Dekdom and say that he's dragging down Wei. Wei was awful in this series as well, which is unfortunate because I think BDD once again played well. He's had a really good start to the split. Mid lane is incredibly contentious right now. Top 6 mid laners in the LCK all feel like absolute world beaters at the current moment, which is unfortunate for the players that end up on teams that aren't quite as consistent around the rest of that. Cuz and Perfect, I think, were generally fine. Perfect was not nearly as good as Doran, but Cuz was, along for the ride. I think there are still positives here for KT to take away from this, especially because I think BDD is just going to win them quite a few games, but sitting at 1 and 2, like, depending on how the rest of this week goes, there is a chance that they're not in the top 3 of this group, even if Group Elder ends ends up winning, which would be a bit of a disappointment. But maybe it could be a blessing in disguise because getting more reps for this team, I think, could be a positive. But for T1, nice win. You know, Smash coming in is definitely interesting. We'll see what happens the rest of the week, whether they want to put Guma back in or, you know, whatever they want to do. You can never predict Coma. That's something that we've always learned. But at the end of the day, basically no matter the configuration for T1, it's nice to see them back on track. Then moving on now to day number 4, and we're not done with top of the table clashes just yet. The most important matchup of the week from my perspective, it was Hanwha Life Esports taking on Dplus KIA. And Dplus KIA is going to pick up yet another victory here. They're going to move to 4-0. They're going to move to 8-3 at the start of this year, and they have solidified themselves at the top of the LCK standings. This mid-jungle duo is as legit as you could possibly ask for. A lot of praise deserves to be going around to DK, and a lot of praise deserves to be going to all of the players that are receiving it. I'm certainly not going to sit here and try and take away any of the positive vibes that are surrounding this team right now. I even kind of want to add more to it because I see some, you know, players being like, oh, or some people being like, oh, this player is only doing well now because this player's back on the team. No, everybody's playing so good on DK right now. They're playing so well. They're so strong in the early and in the mid game, and they control tempo so well. They don't really make mistakes in the mid to late game. This is a super consistent team. This is essentially what HLE was last year, and it's really fun to watch. For Hanwha Life, 2-2 is probably not where they thought they were going to be at this point in the split. Obviously, it's really not ideal. They're still above 500 in terms of game score, and their 2 losses are to the 2 best teams in the league, or at least, you know, what we assume to be the 2 best teams in the league at the current moment, but it's still not really that great of a spot for them to be in. I think they wanted to be more competitive at the top. These are the defending champions. To go down against DK, a team that, yes, got better in the offseason, but not by a ton, or at least on paper, you wouldn't have expected them to get better by a ton, and you made this big offseason acquisition in Zeus. It's not really a great situation, so we'll talk about it with them. But for DK, we got to start talking about the Lucid breakout. Like, this guy is on MVP pace here in the LCK. Not that that's, like, crazy shocking through the first couple of weeks. It's only been 4 series. MVP pace can really go to anybody, but I think this is going to be the year. I think this is the year where Lucid has that Canyon-esque breakout. I don't know if he's ever going to be like what Canyon was individually on things like Nidalee or Kindred, but damn, he sure tried to be in this series, and honestly, he succeeded at multiple points in this series. It just was an excellent performance. When you're going up against someone like Peanut, and you're able to control the tempo so well, and you're honestly just out jungling him really in every capacity, it's just so impressive. There's really nothing that I can say that equates to like a negative in terms of Lucid here. He just has been phenomenal at the start of this season, and again, this is like a trajectory. This is an upward trajectory. This isn't him coming out of nowhere. He showed a lot of these flashes in summer of last year, but it seems like he is putting it together here in year 2. It feels like that sophomore jump that a lot of people in the LCK end up taking is affecting him in a really positive way, and, you know, he could be somebody to watch out for as like a top 5 player in the world moving forward. It genuinely is that kind of performance right now, but I don't want to take anything away from Showmaker in the mid lane, who's also playing at an MVP pace. These two are just playing off of each other so brilliantly. They are the best jungle mid in the league right now, and it's not particularly close. Showmaker's Galio game was excellent, completely shut down Zeka, like actually just completely obliterated him. He has not been nearly as good as Showmaker at the beginning of this year. I ranked him above Showmaker, and that's turned out to not necessarily be correct so far, but again, it's not even that much of a hatred of Zeka or saying that he can't come back from performances like this. It's just genuinely how good Showmaker has been. He is back in that 2021 mindset, that 2020 mindset where he was arguably the best player in the world at the time. Like, he is really playing at that similar level right now. It feels like 2020 Damwon all over again here with just Lucid subbed in for Canyon, and a lot of those vibes are because Beryl is back. Now, I want to make it abundantly clear. I see a lot of people saying that, oh, Lucid is having this breakout and Showmaker is having this bounce back because Beryl is on the roster, and who knows, maybe that's the case, but on tape, it doesn't necessarily indicate that. Beryl has been really good for this team on tape. He's been super aggressive. He adds things to this team that obviously Kellen doesn't. You know, the intangibles I can't calculate. I can't sit here and tell you what he does for this team off the rift in terms of their communication. What I can tell you is that he does make their lives a lot easier in the early game, especially when things are going right. I'm still concerned about what happens when things start to go wrong, but we haven't really seen that so far for DK. We saw the Elise game, but even then, he still made the pivotal pick in the back half of the game to end up winning them that earlier in week number 1. And so, you know, Lucid, Showmaker, and Beryl definitely the standouts. Siwoo is playing well. Aiming has been fine. He's been a player that I barely brought up over the course of this split, which is genuinely best case scenario in my opinion for someone like Aiming, just someone who's playing within in the structure, allowing the rest of his teammates to be primary options, where he can be a secondary option that does a ton of damage in 5v5s, but doesn't have to carry the game. Like, it's perfect. It's a perfect setup here for DK, and right now, this might be the best team in the world. Like, who's to say that they are not the best team in the world right now? 4-0 to start off in the LCK with some big wins, T1 and HLE on that docket, but for Hanwha Life on the other side, it's the opposite. I was already talking about how this team needed to prove more after their win earlier this week against Nongshim, where it felt like they were inconsistent even in victory. Well, here you are, losing to DK and dropping to 500 in terms of your series score. It's just not been the start to the year that Hanwha Life was looking for. Peanut's going to get my dud of the series here. He's making a lot of mistakes right now. Like, I don't think this is going to continue. You know, the Peanut on carries meme, I think, is still very much alive, and honestly, I do kind of buy into that a little bit more than, you know, maybe I did like 2 years ago. Last year really was one of those years where I was like, Peanut on carries doesn't quite hit the same. I still think he can be really good on things like Viego. Like, I don't think that's necessarily, like, the problem. I just think that when you're asking him to be the primary option in the early game, sometimes that can be a little bit, like, against the will of what Hanwha Life like to do in terms of their comfortability. But it wasn't just him. Like, if you wanted to give dud of the series to Zeka, it should go to one of the jungle mid players. They both just got entirely outplayed by their counterparts. Zeka was awful on the Sylas. It's his signature pick, or one of his signature picks. He picks it into Galio and gets absolutely throttled in terms of how he plays the matchup. It just did not work out. Like, he was useless. He wasn't particularly good in game number 1 on the Azir either. Just has not been a great start to the year for Zeka. Viper was fine here, but Delight wasn't necessarily a huge positive. Zeus has been a complete non-factor for this team on the top side of the map. He was bad in week 1 and irrelevant in week 2. It has not been a great start to his Hanwha Life tenure. I'm not going to say this team's dead in the water or anything. They've lost to Gen.G and Dplus KIA. Again, maybe the 2 best teams in the world at the current moment if you want to talk about the best of the best. But at the end of the day, they need to be able to compete with the best of the best. And right now, it just doesn't feel like they're on that same level. This feels like the 3rd or 4th best team in the LCK, which is definitely below expectation going into the year. But huge win for DK and a huge start to the split. This team is for real. Like, we have to start taking them seriously as a top 1 or top 2 team in the world, and I hope that they can keep it up. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and speaking of some of the best teams in the world, we got some revenge here for one of them. It was Gen.G taking on the DN Freecs, and Gen.G does get their win back from earlier in the week, their 2 wins back from earlier on in the week against Bro by picking up the 2-0 series win here. This is the Gen.G we saw in week number 1. This was the Gen.G we expected to see throughout basically all of this split. There's not even really a ton to talk about in terms of them kind of getting back on track. I think we can all just say that the Bro series wasn't really something to be taken all that seriously. It's not really an indictment on Gen.G. It's more just kind of how the LCK goes every once in a while. Anybody can win on any given day because everybody here is pretty good at a base level. Like, even the 10th best player in the role in the LCK can go to Europe and be top 2 basically from day number 1. We've seen that over and over again. That's just how good the players in the LCK are, generally speaking, and I think Gen.G obviously was able to get back on track here. For DNF, things are spiraling out of control. They even make a roster change midway through this week to try and salvage something. Pengyan comes in for Bulldog. If you're not familiar with Pengyan, he was a real breakout star of the playoffs last year in the Challengers League. He was somebody who was fine in the regular season. Like, going back and watching his regular season tape, it was okay, but his playoff run for the Kwangdong Freecs Challengers team was unbelievably good, so much so that he was getting, as far as I'm aware, LCK hype, or at least LTA hype over the course of this offseason, ends up staying in this organization and actually gets his shot here to play in this series. Does fine, generally speaking, but isn't the success story that maybe you were hoping for against Gen.G. Maybe they just wanted to save Bulldog the embarrassment of going up against Chovy. I really don't know, but let's talk about it. Player of the series could go to basically anybody. I mean, this entire team absolutely destroyed DNF. All 5 members were incredible, and they completely outclassed their counterparts on the other side of this matchup. I'm going to go with Canyon. I feel like he was definitely the one that I observed the most throughout this series. He was the one making a lot of the highlight plays, which is good because he was not very good against Bro earlier on this week, but as we all know, Bro has always been Canyon's kryptonite, especially going back to his time on Damwon. Talked about it all the time in like 2022, 2023. on this channel. It just always felt like Canyon had his worst games against Bro, and it's good to see that that has still remained true even here on Gen.G, but he's able to get back on the horse and have a really good series here. I almost gave it to Ruler, not only because the scoreline looks awesome and that he goes deathless in this series, but because he picks up a win on Corki. Corki gets a win. Of course, it's Gen.G that ends up breaking the Corki streak. Not that I'm entirely surprised, nor should you be entirely surprised. Once Gen.G ended up locking it in, it felt like that was going to be the time where the curse ends up being broken, and it was. Duro was excellent. This guy has filled in really well. He's not necessarily felt like a star just yet, but he's actually been really consistent so far for this team. We'll see if that can keep up. Chovy obviously was excellent. Pengyan was put in as essentially a target dummy for Chovy throughout a lot of these, throughout this series and all the moments in this game. It just never really felt like he was set up to succeed on the other side of this, and Chovy took advantage of that, and Keen was definitely the better of these two top laners, not only in lane, but especially in the team fighting stage, and especially in game number 1, where it felt like the Cassante was a massive impact. So great series for Gen.G. Not really a lot of analyzing to do. This is more of what we saw in week number 1. If you want a more detailed breakdown, I guess, of that, go check out that week 1 video. But for DNF, I just don't know what to say. This team has negative chemistry. Like, this is some of the worst synergy I have seen from a player-to-player, like, team in many years. There's honestly nothing else I can say. I don't even know if Pioshik is talking to anybody else on his team. If he is, it's not coming through. Dudu in team fights looks entirely lost. Bro was playing mini Gnar this game. Like, Mega Gnar just did not exist in any of these team fights. I have no clue what was happening in game number 1. Dudu is going to get dud of the series for it. He's not been great at the start of this split, but everything is going wrong for DNF. I think Berserker's mechanics are coming through, and him and Life seem to have good 2v2 chemistry in terms of the early laning phase, but this was probably their worst series as a duo. Berserker didn't really get to do anything, and Life felt entirely outclassed by the many damage dealers on the other side. And like I said, Pengyan was basically thrown in to save Bulldog the embarrassment. I don't know if Bulldog's going to be coming back in for the rest of this winter split, or if this is like them making the change and saying, you know, Pengyan was so good last year in the playoffs that we want to put him in and give him a full-time run because Bulldog has not been trending in the right direction. I honestly wouldn't even really hate that decision considering just how bad the synergy looks on this team, and I don't want to freak out over a loss to Gen.G because, again, anybody can lose to Gen.G, but man, the consistency and the synergy and just the communication, or the perceived communication on this team, just feels completely non-existent. It feels like 5 solo queue players, and that's just never going to work at the LCK level. We saw a brief glimpse of what it could look like in a good way at the beginning of week number 1 in one of the first series on day 1, but ever since then, it's just been an absolute train wreck for DNF. And then for Gen.G on the other side, yeah, this is business as usual. Them getting back on track should not be surprising to anybody, and I would expect this to be the version that we see from them moving forward. Then moving on to our final day of action here in the LCK in week number 2, and it's a battle of two teams with the exact same color palette. It's T1 taking on Nongshim RedForce, and T1 pretty predictably is going to pick up the 2-0 win here. They moved to 3-1 at the start of this year. Their only loss so far is to Dplus KIA. Of course, they play Gen.G at the end of next week, and that's really going to determine a lot in terms of where I think a lot of these teams end up landing, but T1's in a really good spot right now. I think that they have played about as well as you could ask for leading into something like this. I think Smash being in here actually gives me a ton of confidence that this team has a plan and knows kind of what they want to do for this weird league structure, that they want to try some of these players out, that they're not super concerned with where the results would end up lying at any point. Of course, I think they found out after the first week that they were probably going to be in losers group no matter what. I think that could be a pretty plausible theory for why they end up putting someone like Smash in and giving him a lot of time, is these are basically free stage games that don't really have any sort of impact so long as they're not like the worst team in their group. They're going to get to play more best of 3s and best of 5s as the year goes along, and you know, I think this is a pretty good way to deal with this this new format, and why I think we're seeing a lot more changes to a lot of these teams. But it wasn't Smash that ended up taking over in the same way that he did in his first series. It was Owner. This was Owner's series. I mean, he's player of the series. He absolutely massacred Nongshim. This is one of the more dominant performances we've seen from an individual player so far in 2025, regardless of region. This just was an absolute masterclass from Owner. Really glad to see that he still has it in him. Not that that was really all that up for debate, but it's nice to see that he can still be a primary option in games like this. But the Lilia, holy lord, was it a good game. Like, he just obliterated Nongshim, completely out-jungled Gideon, took advantage of Fisher being way too far forward on these melee champions like Akali, and, you know, Lehen's not really having prio to be able to play as aggressively as maybe he would want. Kingin just dying on repeat over and over again. Owner just doing everything in his power to make Nongshim's life as difficult as possible, and obviously very much accomplished that. But I do want to give another shout out to Smash and KIA, of course, because I think both of them were still really good here. Caitlyn Elise is a very difficult lane to play into in game number 1, and of course the Jinx Lulu. People are laughing because Smash comes in, Gumayusi comes out, and they pick Caitlyn and Jinx, Guma's 2 best champions, which is always very funny. But again, I want to reiterate, I don't think this is benching Guma. I don't think this is them saying we want to see if, Smash is going to be our starter for the rest of the year. At least that's what I don't think that's the primary plan for why they're putting Smash in. What I think they're doing is just taking advantage of a format where these games are essentially free scrims against a lot of these teams on stage, and I do think that Smash needs the experience and deserves the experience and is somebody that they're probably looking at to potentially, like, maybe move forward with. Like, I don't know what Guma's status is contract-wise at the end of this year, but they could potentially be looking at a future with Smash as the starting AD carry. So him coming in and playing so well, I think, is a big positive. Doran, Faker, they were good as well. I'm certainly not going to, shit-talk them. Doran in particular was definitely the better of these 2 top laners, but at the end of the day, this was Owner's series. Like, he was the one player to walk out of this feeling like an absolute superstar, and he deserves all of the praise from it. And then for Nongshim on the other side, like, they're just a bottom tier team. Like, maybe not bottom, like, I think they're better than, like, BNK FearX, or at least I would assume that they're better than a team like FearX, but they're not much better, you know what I mean? They're a team that is going to struggle to be able to beat any team that has consistent talent across the board because they are so top heavy in terms of their roster. Their bad players are just not playing well. And unfortunately, sometimes even their, like, high name brand players don't play well. Like here, with Kingen being awful and getting dud of the series, I think you could give this to Gideon as well. You could honestly even give it to Lehens, who I thought was really kind of taken out of this series. I don't blame it entirely on Lehens. I think that there was a lot that ended up going wrong for Nongshim, and Lehens was trying his best in this series, but Kingen was not. He was really bad on the Aurora and on the Renekton, even with Doran not necessarily pressuring him all that much. I get that you're going into, like, Cassante and Bessa in game number 2, which is an absolute nightmare, but still, you have to be able to try and survive a little bit in these matchups, and he just was not doing that particularly well. Gideon, like I said, got completely out-jungled. Fisher and Jiwoo were fine. Fisher's scoreline looks really good, but he wasn't nearly as effective, I would say, as that scoreline would entail. Typically speaking, Faker likes to take it easy on the former T1 players to try to raise their stock. It's always been the case with players like Closer, and so not surprised to see it be the case here for someone like Fisher as well, but Nongshim's just not on that level. They're a bottom 3 team or so in the LCK, and they're going to be ranked accordingly in my power rankings, but nice win for T1. They might be the best team in Group Baron. I don't know what's happening with Hanwha Life right now, but T1 certainly looks better than them in terms of their current form. Hopefully that keeps up. Again, I don't know how many roster substitutions this organization is going to go through this year, but I do like the fact that they are trying to take advantage of some of the weird formatting things here. But then we get to move on to our final series of the week here, and it's a matchup between some former teammates here, as we saw KT Rolster take on OK BRION, and KT is going to pick up the victory here. They are going to win 2-0. They're going to move themselves to 2-2, and unfortunately, just as we said earlier, the Gen.G loss was a little bit of a flash in the pan. The Bro win definitely feels like a flash in the pan. What isn't is Hype being really good. Hype is a really good player, and there's a lot to like. Their closer has honestly been fine. At the start of this year, he has not been a problem at all. He has been more than serviceable as a starting mid laner. Not a superstar, but certainly someone you can have in the mid lane. And Morgan, I think, is obviously someone you feel good about, but we'll get to jungle because, man, every single one of their losses so far this year can be pointed back to the jungle position, and it's just not going well for Bro. And I hate to say it, like, this is not me trying to take a victory lap, but I don't know how many times we have to go through the lesson of it's hard to be a rookie in the LCK before we believe it. Look on the other side of this. It's not like Wei is doing much better. He is also one of the weaker players in the league right now, and he didn't even play particularly well in this series, but the top side of the map was so strong for KT that they were able to get over the top. So let's talk about it. BDD is once again player of the series. If they're going to win, it's going to be BDD. Like, he is going to have to 1v9. He's going to have to carry. He is going to have to be the guy driving the cart in order for them to win games. Just seems to be the way that it is. Cuz is a really good player, and I think that while he hasn't started off 2025 incredibly hot, I certainly think there are still issues with how he's played the game. Like, I feel fine about him moving forward. He's not really gone extended periods of time being awful in quite a long time. And, he was definitely better than Hambach here, even if I do think he could have done a lot more in this series, but BDD is the guy. If you need somebody to carry games for KT, it better be in the mid lane, or it's just not going to happen. It makes KT very predictable, and it makes them very easy to exploit in their current state because the bot lane is just not very good. They're bottom 2 in the league, or maybe even bottom 1 if you really want to go that route. You know, Perfect, I think, is solid on the top side, but he's not a game breaker. He's not this guy that's going to be able to carry you in late game team fights. And like I said, Cuz isn't dominating right now. BDD has to do so much for KT. Lucky for them, he is able to do that. He's good enough to be able to perform like that. I just don't know if that's a recipe for success long-term for a team like KT. We'll have to see. The Azir, the Yone, both looked very good here, and he was the best player in this series, but he's going to have to be in order for this team to be as competitive as they want. Perfect was, ironically enough, probably the second best player in this series. Morgan was really good on the other side of this, but Perfect was just a little bit better, and I think that is a really encouraging sign. He is a player that I think has gotten better, over the past couple of, months, really going back to Summer Split. It feels like that progression has very much been linear, which is very good for Perfect. It's not easy being a rookie. This is year 2 for him. If he can take that leap, maybe not as much as someone like Lucid is right now, but, just becoming a solid top laner, a top 4, top 5 guy, like somebody that can compete, be a little bit better than someone like Kingen, like that's a perfectly fine place for Perfect to be. If he can be what Morgan is for Bro, that's a perfectly fine place for Perfect to be. And like I said, I think Cuz is going to get back on track. This series was fine. I'm certainly not trying to talk down to him. I just think that he could be capitalizing on some of his advantages a bit more, which I want to see I want to see more out of him, I should say. I still think that their bot lane is not very good. Dektum, I think, was fine here. Mechanically speaking, he didn't really make any major mistakes. He just was super passive, which is definitely a bit disappointing, but I'm going to be honest, Wei is just not playing very well right now. Again, I know people really want him to be good, and so they're going to talk about some of the good things that he did here, and there were good things. The Caitlyn Elise lane did end up going well, I would say, overall for KT, but I still think he's making way too many weird mistakes. And again, this is normal. This is kind of expected. This is just what happens with rookies, regardless of how good they were in the Challengers League. There has been nobody, really, that has made that transition, like, super seamlessly, that has not run into any problems over the past, especially 3 years, where the talent level has just gone up. Hype looks great, and honestly, he might be one of the few players that I think can make that transition relatively effortlessly, but Wei right now, not really doing that. Dektum and him certainly struggling as a duo. Lucky for them, they have BDD to bail them out. And then for Bro, it certainly carries over. The KT Challengers connection very much carries over. Hanwha is the easiest dud of the series. This guy is just not playing well. Like, I get it. The series against Gen.G happened, and he looked really good into Canyon. Not so much in the early game, but very much in the team fighting stage. He was able to make a lot of highlight plays, and I think that is where he is inevitably going to thrive as a player if he does get on the right track, but he can't get through the early game right now. Like, his early games are awful, like genuinely awful, some of the worst in the entire league. He has been, by my metrics so far, a little bit of a spoiler alert. I don't usually talk about my metrics too much, but he is currently grading out as the worst player in the LCK, which is not a very good place for him to be, and I get it, it's super early on, but I want to reiterate, it's freaking hard to make the transition from Challengers League to the LCK, especially if you don't have superstar talent around you. Hype is the best player on this team right now. He is also a rookie. Closer is fine. Morgan is fine. These are not superstars. You don't have a BDD or a Cuz on this team to be able to kind of guide you through some of these tougher matchups like someone like Wei has. Wei can struggle on KT because they can still win games even if he isn't going to play perfectly. If Hanwha is going to be this bad, Bro is going to be bad, and that is a disappointing place to be, but he just has to be better. He was dud of the week in week number 1. He was awful in both of their first 2 series. He's not going to get that this week because they did beat Gen.G, and he was okay in that series, but this is another example of him just not really looking like he's ready right now, which is unfortunate because, again, it's hard to be ready, but they kind of needed him to be. Morgan, Closer, Hype, they were fine. Even Polu, they were fine. It was really Hanwha that was dragging down Bro in a lot of these games. He's going to have to be better, and if not, Bro is going to be a team that is competing to be bottom 1, and, things aren't set in stone or anything like that, depending on game scores and just the way things go in week 3. Bro has a pretty decent chance to not be the first team eliminated here. Only one team eliminated in group stage, and 9 teams end up at the very least making it into, like, the play-in stage, but Bro could be one of those teams that ends up on the outs looking in, and certainly I think if they even get into the play-in stage, they're not going to be crazy effective there. It just doesn't feel like this team is going to be ready in winter. Hopefully they can grow into something more, but KT doesn't feel significantly better. Again, very similar to what we've said about DRX, like it is mid lane or bust for KT, but I would argue it's even more mid lane or bust right now because their bot lane is significantly worse than DRX is right now. There's just not a lot going right for KT outside of BDD, but BDD is so good that he's able to get them over the hump. Now, Perfect is good. I think he's a perfectly serviceable player because I think we'll get back on a better track right now, but it's not like KT is blowing me away with a win like this. All right, but that is going to do it for week number 2 of the LCK Cup here in 2025. My overview and analysis up on the screen, the updated standings after 2 weeks of action. Most of this is already done, and in fact, the groups have already been decided with 13 wins. That is the magic number to get Group Elder over the top. They are guaranteed winners group, and that means that they are guaranteed to get the top 3 teams immediately as the top 3 seeds into the playoffs. Right now, that's looking like DK, Gen.G, and DRX, but a lot still to play for in that third and final week. That means Group Baron is guaranteed to be the losers group, and that means the bottom team in Group Baron is guaranteed to get eliminated here. So we'll talk about that, but up on the screen you can see the standings. The numbers on to the left next to every single team would indicate where their individual seed would be right now for the playoffs or the play-ins or anything like that. So top 3 teams in Group Elder would be the top 3 seeds, and then everybody else would get seeded based off of their records, both, you know, series record and then of course game score. You could also see a couple of more things. Power rank would indicate where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10 and change how that has changed from last week to this week. So we can go over risers and fallers and teams that have locked themselves in. Of course, you can see some teams highlighted, DK highlighted in blue. That means they are guaranteed to get into the playoffs. They do not need to go into the play-ins regardless of what happens next week. They will be one of the top 3 seeds heading in to the playoffs. Nongshim at the bottom of Group Elder, guaranteed to not be top 3 in Group Elder, which means that they are in the play-in stage. That's why they are green. Same thing with T1 and HLE, because they are the best teams in Group Baron and they are guaranteed to be top 4 in Group Baron, but all 3 of the bottom teams still kind of open and up for debate in terms of who is going to be eliminated. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Number 1 is going to stay Gen.G for me. Some people are going to want this to be Dplus KIA, and honestly, right now they look like the number 1 team in the world. You know, them and Billy Gaming have been the 2 most dominant teams, but Gen.G's 3 wins have proven to me that when this team is trying, when they're not just randomly losing to Bro, they're still the best team in the world, so I'm going to keep them there for now. But DK does jump up to number 2, and as you can see, number 2 not falling down to number 3 because T1 is going to take their place back at number 3 after I moved them down last week. DK was just so good against T1, but as we have learned, that's not a bad loss for T1 by any stretch. It turns out that was actually a pretty decent loss, and they're going to move back up to number 3. And HLE, because of that, is going to fall all the way down to number 4. Right now, they barely feel like a top 4 team. I get it. They've lost to number 1 and number 2 in my power rankings, but I need to see so much more. Even in their wins, they don't look particularly consistent. Their series against Nongshim earlier this week was really not all that great from them. They beat a team they should, and it took them a lot more time, and it was a lot more difficult than it needed to be. So Hanwha Life still needs to prove a lot to me, but for now, they're going to stay in the top 4 because it's not like the LCK is like brimming with talent or brimming with consistency, we'll just say. Outside of that, 5 and 6 are very difficult, but for me right now, they land on KT Rolster at 5 and DRX at 6. I very much considered flipping these 2 around because honestly, DRX has been better than KT so far in 2025. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. I certainly trust the DRX bot lane more, and I think both of these teams are very comparable, but I think BDD is better than UCal, or at least I would expect BDD to be better than UCal, which is why I have KT at 5 and DRX at 6, even if I do think they're very similar teams that are constructed very similarly. But that means DNF falls to number 7 out of the top 6. That shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody who watched this week. They kind of collapsed. Their communication is just a disaster, and it feels like they have negative synergy at the moment. And bottom 3 is kind of locked in for me. Nongshim coming in at number 8. I think some people might want them lower, like number 9 or so. For me, they still come in at 8 because I think they will do fine against the bad teams in the league, as we saw against Bro earlier on in the LCK Cup, but they're obviously going to struggle against the actually good teams because they just don't have a very well-constructed roster. Bro is going to sit at 9, even though they beat Gen.G 2-0 and they looked really good, because their 3 losses are the real version of them, or at least that's what I assume is the real version of them, and that version of them is not very good. It's one of the worst teams in the entire league. BFX was the right call to put at number 10 in my preseason power rankings, and they have stayed there ever since. This is clearly the worst team in the LCK. That top side is just literally unplayable, but there are so many spots open for grabs. Basically, from number 5 downwards, you could make a case for quite a few teams, and if somebody has a breakout week number 3 or does really well in the play-ins, you could be a top 4 team in the LCK right now. It's pretty wide open, so let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 2. Player of the week was not difficult, let me tell you. It was Showmaker. He is just on a different level right now. He's prime Showmaker. Like, this is what 2020 Showmaker looked like when we were calling calling him the best player in the world. If he can keep this up, if he can play like this for the rest of the year, Dplus KIA is going to be a top 1 or top 2 team in the world again, and it's going to be because of him. But his teammate Lucid is going to be the #1 honorable mention, the runner-up. Like, Lucid is playing out of his mind. MVP pace, like I already talked about. Both of these guys are on MVP pace. It's genuinely ridiculous how well they play off of each other, and just how consistently they're able to get leads right now. I just don't think other players in the league are doing what these two are doing. They are the very clear player of the week and runner-up. If you wanted to switch them, I could believe that. If you wanted Lucid as player of the week and Showmaker as the #1 honorable mention, I could believe that, but I think one of them has to be player of the week. DK is just too good right now. And then my other honorable mention is going to be Owner, the jungler for T1. Mostly for that series later on in the week, where he just absolutely ran wild. Like, it was genuinely insane watching him play against Nongshim and just destroy that team. You know, if he had just had that first series against KT, he probably wouldn't have been on here, but that was one of the most dominant individual performances we've seen, so he's gonna get that honorable mention. Honorable mention to the honorable mentions, Sponge, the jungler for DRX, who I thought actually had a really good week this week in both of their wins. You know, UCal, I think, is in that zone as well, but Sponge was kind of the guy for DRX this week. I hope that that can keep up, and it's definitely something I'm going to be monitoring, but dud of the week for me was also, unfortunately, pretty easy. It's going to be going to Raptor, the jungler for BNK FearX. Miserable week for Raptor. Really not a lot of encouraging traits to take out of it. He's always been a very feast or famine player, as have a lot of the Sandbox and FearX junglers in the past, but he really exemplifies that, and it was definitely a bit more famine this week. I think that there were other options if you really wanted to go, like Bulldog was benched midway through the week because he was so bad in their first series. I think someone like Wei is very lucky that KT ended up winning that series at the end of the week, because he would have been in contention for Dead of the Week, but really Raptor was the only choice in terms of the outcomes and in terms of the individual performances. It just feels like he has really fallen off a bit from last year, where he did show quite a bit of promise as a feast or famine type of jungler that could win quite a few games for his team. He has not done a lot of winning so far this split, and that top side has been an absolute disaster. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content and does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. And hit subscribe. We're gonna be posting about the LCK all year long, so stick around, hit that bell if you are interested. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.